is based upon merit and fitness and the competitive rating and qualifications. So,
Yeah, I just, as I talk this through, if you talk about involvement in the decision, I would just say had no involvement in the application or something like that, because ultimately, we never make the decision, so we'll always not have an involvement. But I think it just means we have to completely isolate ourselves from that process as I was thinking that through.
okay.
Sorry to be late with that.
No, you're fine. Any other questions about
So
GCCB?
I just would, a comment on Mr. Castillo's suggestion. I mean, in a sense, while we don't do hiring and firing, we do have involvement in the hiring and firing decision. We just had a closed meeting where, among other things, we approved hirings and resignations. And so while the recommendations come from the superintendent, we approve all of those for the people hired by the school board. And so it does seem to me to be appropriate to talk about our involvement in decisions. So, for example, you know, if one of my children, although they're all actually students at George Mason, applied and Dr. Noonan, for some odd reason, recommended that they be employed, then I'd want to recuse myself when the matter came before the board for approval of the superintendent's decision. And I sort of took the language to mean that, but I think the point is right. It's just I do think we have at least a stamp of approval, and at the end of the day, we're responsible as a body for the people who are hired and work in the school division.
Well, I mean, I guess I agree that we should, that a board member would recuse him or herself, but that also, it's not just the decision, because the do me a favor remark would also, and we all see how much trouble that kind of language has gotten us into. That you should be much clearer that, you know, you're out of this altogether, and any kind of hint would be fatal to the application and a violation of the policies.
Could we meet this requirement by just dropping the word decision and just say no involvement with the hiring?
Genius, I like it.
Let me look quickly at the Virginia Code section on that. I think we could. This language, the member certifies that he had no involvement with the hiring decision, does come directly from 2.23119E1 of the code. And I'm often reticent to make changes based on what the Virginia Code says. But if we had a board member certify that he or she had no involvement with the hiring, or no involvement with hiring, I think it would be consistent with the language within the code. So if the board were amenable, we could remove either decision from line 32 or no involvement with hiring. The hiring, yeah. What do you all think? Ultimately, it's your policy, so.
I'll admit to having a slight preference if the text is actually in the statute to just saying what the statute says, even if we disagree with the words of the statute, but I don't feel that strongly about it.
I mean, I like that better drafting. If you can draft better than the drafters of the statute, I'm always up for that. But I just think this is one area where we should be super careful. So that's why an abundance of caution would tell me that it's better. You have to do more than just abstain on that closed session vote is what I'm trying to get across here.
Mm-hmm.
Madam Chair. So just for clarity, what you're actually saying, if I understand your point, Mr. Castillo, is sort of involvement with the hiring process from start to finish, right? Any aspect of it at all. So Okay. Can I follow with a different question? Or are we done with this?
No.
Are we done with that point?
I would, since this is second reading, I do need to hear how the board would like, if the board wants it to say no involvement with the hiring, no involvement with the hiring decision. It could even say no involvement with the hiring process, since that would include both this decision and any recommendation of employment or otherwise. But what would you all like?
Justin, you want to weigh?
I just thought no involvement with the hiring, doesn't that?
And so that would be removing decision from line 32 and removing decision from line 36?
Yes.
And by extension, line 42 and
Well, that's-
line 2 on page 2.
So a superintendent would not be involved in hiring a family member, and a school board member would not be involved in hiring of one of their family members.
Yeah.
If that works for the board, I can make that change. Okay. Thank you.
Madam Chair. So just operationally, just want to make sure that everybody understands. So, like, if someone comes to you and says, hey, your kiddo applied for a job in daycare, would you send their resume? No, is the answer, right? Because that would be involvement in the hiring process. Or do you know if they're free on Wednesdays? Like, you'd have to, I'm just thinking about it from an operational perspective too, like, stay out, right? And my kids, I love them to death, but I don't want them to work for me, so, anyway, okay.
Madam Chair? So I'm going to want to raise a different point also, which is sort of highlighted by the fact that there's some text in red. I really appreciate the extension that we put in here of he or she as the language, because obviously we have school board members that are not men. But I'm actually wondering if we need to have a specific thing, or can we go perhaps a little further and just say they? It's a very generic word. It covers all cases that I know of, and it would be consistent with our policies for non-discrimination in general, and it's very short. I realize that it's also a debate about whether they is ever singular, but that debate's kind of moot. So I don't know what people think. I wanted to make the suggestion that we replace he or she with they, but I'm aware that may be a minority thought.
On my end, it's easy to do. Let me know if that's what the
When
board
is
wants.
this a change we make across every policy? I guess it's every policy in our policy manual, because then that's a different question that I think is maybe a better held for a different conversation. I mean, I don't have any objection to it. I'm just wondering, like, because that goes beyond just this individual policy tonight, right? It goes to every policy that we have. So if we change it here because we want to make sure that we are being consistent, then we need to change it in every single policy, which I think is a bigger, maybe a bigger conversation, and also a larger workload for you, which I think is fun, you know, if, yes, Mr. Webb.
I thought we've done the they in several other policies that we've done, so we might ultimately maybe need to have that bigger conversation about it, but I know we've made that distinction in several other policies, so that's, in general, I'm okay if we do that, but it may need to.
Yeah, can we
as you
table,
bring that
this,
up, yeah.
that discussion, I think, to a different, I'm not in disagreement with it, but can we table that? Because that's not unique to this policy,
Maybe.
unless I'm incorrect. Is it unique to this policy?
I do believe that we have changed that in one or two other policies and when it's been brought to my attention, but as a practical matter, I go through every single policy word
Sure.
for word, and I have a checklist of things that I do with each policy. So if the board desires for he to be changed to he or she, I will universally do that. If the board wants he or she, or just he to be changed to they, that's doable. That's pretty perfunctory. So it's just getting
Can I?
Yeah,
clar-
absolutely.
I think, are you suggesting prospectively, though?
Prospectively.
Right, and I'm thinking, yeah.
Retroactively.
Retroactively, because we have so many policies. That's why I was like, this is a larger discussion that I'm not sure that you meant it to be a larger discussion tonight.
I guess I'm not trying to solve the retrospective problem
Right.
tonight, but going out prospectively, it could be solved from there forward, and then finding out how big a retrospective issue it would be. It could be something.
I think I have helped with about 180 policies so far, and I think some of them do have they, and some of them don't refer to pronouns, so those are going to be reviewed every 5 years. I think we could, if the board wants, we can make the change to this policy, GCCB, and then going forward, as policies come up to be renewed or amended, it can just be incorporated if that's the desire of the board.
Is the will of the board to change all policies going forward? Or would you like to have a discussion about that at a later date?
I'm fine with
Okay.
starting from here on out.
Okay.
I'm fine. My only question is, in some places, like line 23, greater extent than, instead of it saying he or she, then they was employed by the school board, so.
Well, it does raise some grammatical questions because they is not really it's not singular generally, but now it is changing, so.
Typically, you would probably just have to say they were employed, and, you make the verb change that's necessary to make it
Okay.
read grammatically in some way.
Okay, then that's fine with me.
Okay, we have agreement.
Okay. So I will change it at lines 23 to they were, and the remaining 30 and 41 to they. And I think that was it for this policy, and
And I
I'll
think
make
then
sure
we've given you permission to do it.
And going forward.
Effectively going forward.
I'll reflect that in policies I present to the board. And as always, if I miss something, please don't hesitate to correct me.
Just a quick point, and not for this policy, but one thing we perhaps ought to have Ms. Minchin look at is whether we want to have a general policy statement that says, we use the term "they" to refer to singular and plural, just to make clear from if there's ever a statutory or a policy construction litigation, that, that whoever is doing the interpretation understands that we're not using "they" to mean multiple people. And that just,
All right, sounds good.
Anything else on policy GCCB? All right, the last policy for second reading tonight is policy BBFA, Conflict of Interest and Disclosure of Economic Interests. This would replace our current policy or current bylaw 2.9, and as I mentioned at the beginning, well, just flipping through this, there are places where it, reflected in red, says he or she. That will be changed to they. Starting on page 4 at line 43, I've proposed that we remove that language as it mirrors almost identically the language that's in GCCB, and instead adding at lines 40 that employment of any family member of a school board member or superintendent is governed by policy GCCB. I did have a chance to speak with Elizabeth Ewing of the VSBA about this. She said the policies had existed separately, and that's why they'd been amended separately. But I think that this would cover it, since the entirety of policy BBFA talks about conflicts of interest and disclosure of economic interest for all staff members. So then pointing board members and the superintendent towards the anti-nepotism rules that exist in policy GCCB makes sense, rather than reiterating that word for word throughout the policy. Other than that, in the addition of he or she or his or her, which will be changed to they, there were no recommended changes to this policy from the board at first reading. Any questions on BBFA?
Yes, Mr. Anderson.
Not a question, but a comment. I do like that cross-reference. I think that we're in the spirit of reducing words and things. That does a nice job of reducing words and things.
Very good.
So if that concludes our second reading, I would seek a motion to approve second reading adoption of the policies discussed.
Madam Chair, I move that the school board approve the second reading of and adoption of policy